The kitchen was too quiet for a house that used to hum with life. Only the slow tick of the clock and the sizzle of grease in the pan broke the silence. Outside, the late summer wind moved across the Texas plains, carrying with it the smell of dust and mesquite. Inside, Thomas Avery stood at the stove, sleeves rolled up, his weathered hands turning a piece of meat in the skillet. The scent of fried steak mingled with biscuits baking in the oven, butter browning at the edges. It was a meal made from habit, not hunger. He wasn't cooking for himself. Around his neck hung a pair of dull metal tags, clinking softly whenever he moved. They had belonged to his son, Private William Avery, United States Army. 6 months had passed since the telegram came. 6 months since a man in uniform stood on this same porch, hat in hand, voice trembling as he read from a folded piece of paper. 6 months since the world tilted and never quite righted itself. Now the stove hissed and popped like static from a faraway radio. Thomas stared at the pan, lost in the rhythm of it. He could still see his boy sitting at the kitchen table, 19 and proud in his new uniform, grinning as he said, "Save me some of that steak, Pa. I'll be back before you know it." He never came back. The war had carried him across oceans into the hills of Italy, where mud-swallowed boots and artillery thundered through the valleys. They said he died quickly, a shell fragment through the chest. Thomas had read those words over and over until the paper tore along the creases. Died quickly, as if speed made it merciful, as if any death could be tidy enough to fold into a telegram. Outside, an engine groaned up the dirt road. Tires crunched on gravel. Thomas turned down the stove, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked through the window. A military truck rolled toward the house, olive-drab paint faded by dust. In the back sat a handful of men wearing khaki uniforms with stenciled letters on the back, PW, prisoners of war, Germans. He had known they were coming. The army sergeant from the nearby camp had stopped by 2 days ago, polite but nervous. "We're spread thin, Mr. Avery. Need to assign some of the prisoners to help with ranch work. They're good laborers, disciplined. We'll have guards with them, of course." Thomas had nodded once. He didn't argue. He didn't say much at all. Word spread fast through the county. Some of the neighbors came by that evening, voices sharp with anger. "You can't let those bastards on your land, Tom. Not after what they've done. After what they took from you." He had listened, jaw set, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun sank in a haze of orange. "Army says it's the law," he finally said. "I'll do what's required." That was all. No one knew what to make of his calm, so they left him to his silence. The truck rattled to a stop by the barn. A gust of wind lifted dust around the wheels. Thomas stepped. Out onto the porch, the dog tags cold against his chest. The sergeant climbed down first, tipping his cap. "Morning, Mr. Avery. Got your work crew here." The prisoners climbed out one by one. Most were young, barely more than boys. Sunburned faces, eyes hollow from travel, uniforms too big or too small. They stood in a loose line, hands at their sides. Some tried not to meet his gaze. Others looked around, astonished by the wide, empty landscape. Behind them, the guards waited with rifles slung over their shoulders. The heat shimmered on the barrels. Thomas walked down the steps, boots stirring up dust. The sergeant began to speak, but Thomas raised a hand. He stopped a few feet from the line of prisoners, looking at each face in turn. He saw fear there, and confusion, and something else, weariness that had no allegiance. One of them, tall and blond, tried to speak. His English was halting. "We work hard, sir. No trouble." Thomas didn't answer right away. He looked past them toward the fields, the fences half broken from neglect, the cattle milling near the dry creek bed. He had needed help for months, but the idea of accepting it from the enemy twisted his stomach. Finally he said, "Work's hard. Sun's hotter. You do as you're told, you'll eat. That's all you need to know." The sergeant nodded in approval. "Yes, sir. They'll behave." Thomas turned and walked toward the barn. The men followed, heads bowed, boots crunching in rhythm. The air was thick with dust and unspoken words. Inside the barn, the smell of hay mixed with engine oil and sweat. Thomas pointed to the tools lined along the wall. "Fences first. North pasture, water troughs next." His voice carried no warmth, no malice, just the flat authority of a man who'd run out of energy for hate. As the prisoners began their work, Thomas stepped outside again. The sun was climbing high, glaring off the tin roof. He could hear the steady clang of hammers and the low murmur of German words. It sounded almost like music, faint and distant, like a radio from another room. He lit a cigarette, watching the smoke drift upward. He didn't know why he hadn't sent the army away. Maybe it was duty, maybe stubbornness, or maybe, deep down, he wanted to see them, the kind of men his boy had died fighting. He wanted to look them in the eyes and find a reason, some proof that the world still made sense. But all he saw were farm boys. Thin shoulders, sunburned necks, awkward movements, the same kind of boys who once crowded the church pews in town, laughing after service, sneaking looks at the girls. At noon, the sergeant blew a whistle. The men stopped work and gathered by the shade of the barn. Thomas brought out a metal jug of water and a stack of tin cups. He set them on a table without a word. The prisoners lined up, cautious, grateful. Each man nodded as he filled his cup. "Danke," they murmured. Thomas caught himself watching them too long. He turned away, back into the house. Inside, the smell of the morning's cooking still hung in the air. He sat at the table, staring at the empty plate that had once belonged to his son. He thought of the day William left, how he'd made that same meal, chicken-fried steak, mashed potatoes, cornbread fresh from the oven, and pecan pie cooling on the sill. His wife had died years before, so it had been just the two of them. He remembered the way the boy laughed, teasing him about overcooked gravy. "You'll miss my complaints when I'm gone, Pa." Thomas had smiled then. "You come back and I'll burn the next batch just for you." He kept that promise in his head like a prayer. Now he sat alone, sunlight cutting across the table, turning dust motes into gold. Outside, the clang of hammers resumed, steady and relentless. He rubbed his temples, trying to push away the memory of the telegram. When the army men had left that day, the house had gone silent. He'd walked out to the field, the paper crushed in his fist, and dropped to his knees in the dirt. He didn't cry. Not then. The tears came later, in the middle of the night, when the wind rattled the shutters and he thought he heard his boy's boots on the porch. The days that followed blurred together. The cattle still needed feeding. The fences still needed fixing. The world didn't pause for grief. It simply demanded that you keep moving. By late afternoon, the prisoners had cleared the north pasture. The sergeant approached, sweat darkening his collar. "They work hard, sir. We'll be back tomorrow, same time." Thomas nodded. "They can use the well by the shed. Don't waste water." "Yes, sir." The sergeant hesitated. "You sure you're all right with this? Folks in town think it's unusual. You hosting Germans after what happened." Thomas's gaze drifted to the horizon. The sun was lowering, red and swollen. "War's not their doing any more than mine," he said quietly. "They dig, they fix, they go back behind the wire. That's all." The sergeant tipped his hat and left it at that. That night, the house felt emptier than ever. He sat on the porch with a lantern beside him, the light flickering across his face. In the distance, coyotes called to each other, thin and mournful. The prisoners' camp was a few miles away, but he could see the faint glow of their lights on the horizon like stars fallen to earth. He wondered what they were thinking, those boys from across the sea. Did they dream of home the way his son had? Did they write letters they knew would never reach anyone? He tried not to care. But caring was what had made him human once, and he didn't know how to stop. The next morning came early, pale light spilling over the plains. Thomas was already up, coffee steaming in his cup when the truck arrived again. The same faces climbed down, dust rising around their boots. The sergeant saluted him briefly. This time. Thomas didn't wait on the porch. He met them by the barn, pointing out new tasks. The rhythm of labor filled the air again. The scrape of shovels, the ring of nails, the distant bawl of cattle. As the day wore on, he began to notice details. One of the Germans, Karl, the blond one who had spoken before, handled the horses with surprising gentleness. He moved slowly, murmuring words in German that calmed the nervous animals. Another, shorter man with dark hair sang under his breath as he worked, a tune soft and mournful. Something about it reminded Thomas of his wife humming in the kitchen years ago before sickness took her. The sound hit him in the chest. He turned away quickly, pretending to inspect a fence post. At noon, he brought out water again. The men nodded, grateful. One of them hesitated, then offered him something small, a carved wooden figure of a horse, Rough but careful work. "For thanks," the man said, his accent thick. "We make when not work." Thomas stared at it. The carving was crude but earnest. He didn't take it. "Keep it," he muttered. "You'll need something to pass the time." The man nodded, slipping it back into his pocket. That night, after the truck carried them away, Thomas found himself standing in the kitchen again. He looked at the stove, at the skillet resting on the counter. He thought of his son's last meal, the one they never got to share again. The house smelled faintly of dust and old grease. He turned on the stove, poured oil into the pan, and waited for it to heat. When the first wisp of smoke rose, he dropped in a piece of steak. The sound was sharp and alive. For a moment he felt like he could almost hear his boy's voice again. He cooked without knowing why. Maybe out of habit, maybe to remember, or maybe to forget. When it was done, he set the plate on the table and stared at it. The chair across from him stayed empty. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far away. The air smelled of rain. He sat there until the food went cold. The following week, the army brought the prisoners again. Their English was improving. They greeted him with awkward good mornings and shy nods. Carl, the blond one, offered a salute. Thomas grunted in reply. They worked through the heat, repairing a broken windmill. When the blades finally turned, catching the breeze, Carl smiled proudly. Thomas found himself nodding before he could stop. "Good work," he said quietly. The words felt strange in his mouth. The sergeant noticed. "They're not bad men, sir, just on the wrong side." Thomas didn't answer. He looked at the young German wiping sweat from his brow, the same way his son used to after mending fences. That night, he dreamed of William for the first time in months. The boy stood in the doorway, sunlight behind him, smiling. "You still cooking my favorite, Pa?" he asked. Thomas reached for him, but the dream dissolved into darkness. He woke before dawn, heart pounding. He sat at the kitchen table, the dog tags cold against his chest. Outside, a coyote yipped somewhere in the distance. He ran a hand over his face and whispered, "I miss you, boy." The truck would come again soon. The men would work, and he would watch, and the days would pass like the wind over the plains. But something had begun to shift, subtle as the turning of the seasons. The lines between enemy and neighbor were blurring, erased not by forgiveness, but by familiarity. And though Thomas would never admit it, a thought was forming quietly in the back of his mind, a dangerous, tender thought that would soon change everything. Maybe, he wondered, the best way to honor his son wasn't through silence or anger. Maybe it was through the very thing he had spent his life doing, feeding the living. The mornings came early on the Avery ranch. Before the sun cleared the horizon, the first sounds of movement stirred the still air, boots on dry earth, the squeak of a gate, the distant call of cattle. The war felt far away in those hours when the light was soft and the world seemed to start over. But Thomas Avery carried the war with him, tucked in the pocket of his shirt where his son's dog tags clinked against his heart. The German prisoners arrived each morning in the same dusty truck, their heads ducked low under the canvas roof. They climbed down in silence, thin and pale from months of confinement. The guards called their names, clipped and brisk, and handed out the tools of labor: shovels, hammers, wire cutters, axes dulled by time. Then the day began. Thomas gave orders with gestures more than words. His voice was steady, his eyes cool and unreadable. "Fences first," he'd say, "then water troughs. Move the cattle before noon." The prisoners nodded, though most of them barely understood English. Work didn't need translation. They were mostly boys from Bavaria and Saxony, farmhands, mechanics, mill workers before the draft had swallowed them whole. They moved carefully at first, afraid to make a wrong step, afraid that a glance or a muttered word might draw punishment. But Texas had its own rhythm, slow and practical. No one shouted unless it was to warn about a loose bull or a rattlesnake hiding in the grass. The son did most of the disciplining. As the days stretched into weeks, Thomas began to see them not as shadows of his grief, but as men of flesh and dust. He noticed how they wiped sweat from their brows the same way his boy once did, forearm across the forehead, a faint smile tugging at the corner of the mouth. He saw how they handled animals with care, how they murmured to the horses in their own language, the syllables soft and steady. Karl Weiss stood out among them. He was tall, broad-shouldered, no older than 20. His hair was the color of hay bleached by sun. When he worked, he kept his back straight and his focus sharp, but there was a gentleness to him too, an awkward, almost boyish way of pushing his hat back whenever he grew nervous, a small gesture that cut Thomas like a blade. William had done the same thing. Every time he saw Carl do it, Thomas had to look away. One afternoon, Thomas found Carl repairing a fence along the southern pasture. The barbed wire was tangled, the wooden posts dry and splintered. Carl's hands moved with quiet efficiency, wrapping the wire, driving nails, testing the tension with a practiced tug. Thomas watched from a few feet away, arms crossed. Finally he said, "You done farm work before." Carl turned, startled. His English was clumsy but clear enough. "Yes, sir. Father had farmed near Dresden. Cows, wheat, little bit everything." Thomas nodded once. "Figures. You handle the tools right." Carl smiled faintly, unsure if it was praise. "Work same here, only sun, much hotter." Thomas allowed the ghost of a grin. "That it is." It was the first time they had spoken without an interpreter. The moment was small, gone almost as soon as it began, but it left something behind, an invisible crack in the wall between them. As the days passed, work began to shape them all into a quiet rhythm. The Germans rose before dawn, ate breakfast in the camp, then rode the truck out to the ranch. The guards leaned in the shade with rifles across their knees, but they rarely needed to use them. The land itself kept the prisoners contained. Miles of empty plains stretched in every direction, offering freedom that could kill a man before it saved him. Under the brutal Texas sun, distinctions of nation blurred. Sweat had the same taste on every tongue. Hunger spoke the same language. Work became its own kind of truce. The Germans repaired windmills, dug new irrigation lines, and herded cattle with surprising skill. Some even learned to rope calves, laughing when their first throws missed by a mile. At first, Thomas kept his distance. He told himself it was better that way. But grief has a strange way of seeking company, and silence only echoes louder when you have no one to share it with. One evening, after a long day, he saw Carl sitting alone near the barn, sharpening a tool. The others were talking quietly in German, trading stories of home. Thomas found himself walking over. "You miss it?" he asked. Carl looked up, uncertain. "Miss home," Thomas said. "Germany." Carl nodded slowly. "Yes, I miss my mother's bread. I miss noise of church bells. Every morning, same time, hear only wind." Thomas stared into the distance. "You get used to the wind," Carl smiled faintly. "Maybe. You miss your son, yes?" The question landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Thomas didn't answer right away. He looked at the young man in front of him, the same age William had been when he left, and felt something twist inside. "Every day," he said finally. Carl nodded, as if he understood, though neither of them said more. That night, Thomas lay, awake long after the house had gone dark. He thought of his boy's voice, the way it cracked when he laughed, the way he'd said, "See you soon, Pa," like it was a promise he could keep. Days became weeks. The Germans worked hard, and the ranch began to look alive again. The fences stood straight, the windmills turned freely, the cattle grew fat on tall grass. The sergeant from the camp, a man named Harper, stopped by one evening with his usual clipboard. "They're doing good, Warren," he said. "Haven't had a single infraction in 2 months. You've got a knack with them." Thomas gave a quiet snort. "I don't talk much. Maybe that's the trick." Harper grinned. "Maybe it is. Say, the boy's been talking. End of the week's a holiday back at camp. Command says we can do a proper hot meal for the ones working ranch detail. You got the space, Mr. Avery. Mind if we bring the grub here?" Thomas thought about it for a long moment. The word meal settled heavy in his mind. It pulled him back to a memory, the night before William shipped out, when the smell of gravy filled the kitchen and laughter had come easy. He cleared his throat. "You don't need to bring anything. I'll cook." Harper blinked. "You sure? It's a lot of mouths." "I'll manage," Thomas said. The sergeant studied him, as if searching for something in his face. "All right then, we'll be here at sundown Friday." When Harper drove off, Thomas stood in the doorway of his kitchen, staring at the stove. The silence pressed in around him. He knew exactly what he was going to make. Friday morning came hot and windless. The sky was a hard, endless blue. Thomas rose before dawn, tying his apron the way his wife once had. He laid out flour, eggs, buttermilk, and slabs of tenderized beef. The skillet hissed when he dropped the first piece in. The smell of frying meat filled the room, thick and nostalgic. He made mashed potatoes with cream and butter, cornbread golden at the edges, and a pecan pie cooling on the windowsill. Every detail matched the memory. As he worked, ghosts moved quietly through the kitchen. He heard William's voice teasing him again. "You always burn the first one, Pa." He heard his wife laughing softly as she kneaded dough. The past folded over the present like two layers of the same sky. By mid-afternoon, the house was a furnace of heat and smell. The prisoners were still working outside, unaware of what was coming. Thomas stepped onto the porch to catch his breath. The fields shimmered under the sun. The air was thick enough to taste. He saw Carl near the corral, helping a horse drink from the trough. The animal nuzzled his shoulder like an old friend. The sight caught Thomas off guard, gentleness in the middle of war, kindness where there should have been only duty. When the truck finally returned from the camp, Harper climbed out, wiping sweat from his neck. "Smells like heaven out here," he said. "You really went all out?" Thomas just nodded. "They've earned a meal." The prisoners lined up near the barn, confused but curious. The guards stood back, rifles slung low. Tables had been set out under the open awning, wooden planks balanced on sawhorses, covered with clean cloths. Thomas carried out the dishes himself, platters of steak, bowls of potatoes, baskets of cornbread. The smell made the men murmur among themselves in disbelief. Harper raised his voice. "All right, boys, you can sit. Mr. Avery's feeding you proper tonight." The prisoners hesitated, uncertain. Thomas saw their eyes dart from the guards to him as if expecting a trick. He set down a plate and said simply, "Eat." His voice was flat but not unkind. Carl was the first to sit. He bowed his head briefly, then took a bite. The others followed, cautiously at first, then hungrily. Conversation broke out in German, laughter low and surprised. For a moment the barn sounded less like a camp, and more like a gathering of farmhands after a long harvest. Thomas stood back, arms folded. He hadn't planned to join them. He just watched, the way he used to watch his son and his friends crowd around the table, laughing with their mouths full. The smell, the sound, it all came rushing back. Carl looked up and caught his eye. He stood, wiping his mouth, and said in careful English, "Sir, we thank you. We eat for your son." The words hit Thomas like a blow. The noise of the room faded, replaced by the soft ringing in his ears. He tried to speak but found nothing in his throat. He only nodded once before turning away. Inside the kitchen, he leaned against the counter, gripping the edge so hard his knuckles went white. The smell of food clung to him, but now it felt like a weight he couldn't bear. His mind flooded with memories. The telegram, the empty bed, the letter he never finished. He remembered sitting at this same table months ago, pen in hand, trying to write to William one last time after the news came. "Your mother's roses are blooming," he had written. "The cattle are fat this year." Then he'd stopped. There was no one to send it to. Outside, laughter echoed faintly. It wasn't cruel. It was just alive. He pressed his eyes shut, a single tear cutting through the dust on his cheek. For the first time since the telegram, he let it happen. He didn't wipe it away. When he finally stepped back outside, the sun was setting. The sky burned orange and violet over the plains. The prisoners had finished eating. Some were helping to clean up, stacking plates, sweeping crumbs from the tables. Carl approached, hesitant. "Good food," he said softly. "Remind me of home. My mother cooked same way." Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "My boy liked it too." Carl nodded, understanding without needing translation. "He was soldier." Thomas swallowed hard. "Italy." Carl's eyes lowered. "My brother died in Italy too." The silence between them was thick with something larger than either man, grief shared by enemies who had never meant to be enemies at all. The truck engine started in the distance. Harper called out, "Time to roll out, boys." The Germans climbed aboard, waving shyly as they left. Carl was the last to go. He touched the brim of his cap in quiet respect. Then they were gone, leaving only dust and the long hum of crickets in the twilight. Thomas stood there until the light faded completely. The tables sat empty, the plates stacked neatly like headstones. The smell of fried steak lingered in the air, heavy and sweet. He thought of William again, not as a soldier or a name on a telegram, but as a boy laughing over supper, gravy on his chin, alive in a way memory could never quite recapture. That night, Thomas sat alone at the kitchen table with a single slice of pie. He didn't pray. He didn't speak. He just listened to the quiet breathing of the house and the wind moving through the trees outside. For the first time in months, the silence didn't hurt. It felt almost like peace. He took one bite of pie, sweet and soft, and whispered to the empty chair across from him, "You'd have liked them, son. You really would." The night had come softly, spreading across the plains like ink poured into water. The heat of the day lingered only in the earth, radiating faintly through the soles of Thomas Avery's boots. Inside the barn, lanterns hung from nails and rafters, their light flickering in wide circles across the faces of the men who sat waiting. The air carried the mingled smells of hay, smoke, and the remnants of a meal that had somehow felt too generous to belong to wartime. The German prisoners sat along the wooden tables, shoulders drawn close, hands resting uneasily beside their tin plates. They were not used to this kind of meal, food that smelled of comfort instead of survival. The guards watched quietly from the periphery, rifles slung loose. Even they seemed uncertain whether to interrupt the moment or to protect it. Thomas stood at the far end of the barn, his hands trembling slightly as he poured coffee from a blackened pot into each cup he passed. The men looked up as he moved along the line, his boots slow on the packed dirt. Some nodded, others whispered, "Danke," under their breath, the foreign syllables softened by gratitude. He stopped when he reached Carl. The young man's plate was nearly empty. A few crumbs of cornbread clung to the edge. Carl looked up, his blue eyes uncertain in the flickering light. Thomas set the cup down gently before him. "More coffee?" he asked. Carl hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, please." Thomas poured, the steam curling upward. The smell was earthy, bitter, familiar. He had made this same coffee hundreds of mornings before his son left for the army, before the telegram, before grief turned his voice into something quiet and heavy. The barn was silent except for the scraping of forks and the low hum of the wind through the open doors. Every man there could feel it, the strangeness of the scene. A Texan rancher serving supper to German soldiers, enemies and host at the same table. It wasn't forgiveness that filled the air, not yet. It was something rawer, something more uncertain, a recognition that for one small evening, war had been kept outside the door. Thomas's movements slowed. He set the coffee pot down on the table, leaning slightly on the edge. His breath came shallow. He looked out over the men eating under the lantern light and saw not soldiers, but sons, each one carrying a face that might have belonged to someone's child, someone's lost hope. Carl seemed to sense the weight pressing down on the older man. He pushed back his chair, stood, and removed his cap. The movement caught the other's attention. The barn fell completely still. Carl cleared his throat. His voice came halting and accented, each word shaped carefully, like a man building a bridge he wasn't sure could hold. "For your son, sir," he said, lifting his cup slightly. "We eat to honor him." The words hung there, fragile as glass. No one moved. Thomas's mouth opened, but no sound came. The smell of fried steak and gravy still clung to his hands. The room blurred at the edges. He felt something break loose inside, a dam he hadn't even known he'd built. He sat down slowly, almost without realizing it. His hands found the table, rough beneath his palms, the same table his boy had sanded smooth years before when he'd first learned to work wood. Tears gathered before he could stop them, hot and silent, dripping onto the worn grain. They left small dark circles where they fell, spreading like ink on parchment. Carl stood frozen, uncertain whether to sit or stay standing. The other prisoners bowed their heads quietly. Some crossed themselves. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint buzz of cicadas outside and the low creak of the barn timbers in the night wind. It wasn't pity in their eyes. It was something deeper. Respect. Recognition. They knew that look of loss. They had worn it themselves in the trenches of Italy and the deserts of North Africa, when friends vanished in smoke and shell fire. War had taught them all the same lesson: grief knows no language. Thomas tried to speak, but his voice failed. He swallowed hard, breath shaking. He liked this meal, he whispered at last, said it made him feel like home. Carl nodded, eyes glistening. Then tonight, we are home too. Something in the man's sincerity struck Thomas like a blow. The grief that had sat in his chest for months, hard and heavy as a stone, shifted, cracked, and began to crumble. He looked around at the faces before him, the German boys, some barely men, their eyes tired and kind, their uniforms worn to threads, not monsters, not the enemy, just sons. The lanterns flickered, again, and the shadows seemed to soften. Outside, a whippoorwill called across the fields. The sound reminded Thomas of nights long ago when his boy would chase fireflies by the creek, laughing until his voice disappeared into the dark. For the first time since the telegram, that memory didn't feel like punishment. It felt like a gift. He wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "Finish your meal," he said quietly. "It's getting cold." The men obeyed, still solemn, still hushed. The clinking of cutlery returned, gentle and rhythmic. When the last plate was clean, the guards began loading dishes back into the truck. Carl lingered, helping gather cups. As the others filed out, he turned once more to Thomas. "Your son," he said softly. "He was good man, I think. You are good father." Thomas looked at him, searching for anger and finding none. "I was just lucky to have him as long as I did." Carl extended a hand, tentative but steady. Thomas hesitated only a second before taking it. Their palms met, rough against rough, two men joined by the same invisible wound. When the truck finally rumbled down the dirt road toward the camp, the night returned to stillness. Thomas stood in the open doorway of the barn, lantern in hand, watching the taillights fade into the dark. The fields stretched endlessly beyond, silvered by moonlight. He turned back to the empty tables. Crumbs glimmered on the cloth, a few drops of coffee cooling in tin cups. The air still held the warmth of the meal, the ghost of laughter that had briefly replaced silence. He sat down again, alone now, and rested his hand on the place where Carl's cup had stood. He didn't think of forgiveness, not yet. The word felt too tidy, too small. What he felt was something quieter, a surrender to humanity itself, a recognition that loss belonged to everyone. His son had been one among millions, and yet, in grief, every man was the same. For the first time since the war began, Thomas looked up and saw the stars. They had always been there, but he'd spent too long staring at the ground to notice. The night sky seemed impossibly wide, the constellations bright and steady. He thought of his boy somewhere beyond those stars, maybe laughing at the sight of his father, feeding the very men he once called the enemy. He smiled through the ache. "You'd understand," he whispered. "You always did." The following week, the ranch felt different. The Germans worked with more ease, their laughter less restrained. The guards stopped shouting instructions, content to let the rhythm of ranch life carry the day. Thomas noticed how the men sang while they worked, old folk songs that drifted through the heat like prayers carried by the wind. He still wore his son's dog tags, but they no longer felt like a weight. They hung lightly now, clinking softly against his chest, a heartbeat of metal and memory. Every day, Carl greeted him with a nod and a "Morning, sir." It became a kind of ritual. They spoke more often, about the horses, about the land, about home. Carl told stories of his family's farm near Dresden, of a river that froze each winter, of a sister who played piano. Thomas listened quietly, surprised at how the young man's words filled the empty spaces of the day. In return, Thomas told him about Texas storms, about how lightning could roll for miles across the plains, splitting the sky open like judgment. He told him about his boy's stubbornness, how William once tried to break a wild colt alone and ended up flat in the dirt, laughing through a mouthful of dust. Carl laughed too, the sound warm and genuine. Work became more than labor. It became a language of its own. A post hole dug without complaint, a trough filled before being asked, a fence straightened perfectly without direction. Each act spoke quietly of respect. By early autumn, the war in Europe was nearing its end. Rumors reached even the isolated corners of Texas, whispers of German surrender, of Allied victories, of cities in ruins. The prisoners grew restless. Some were relieved, others terrified. Carl said little, but Thomas could see the turmoil in his eyes. One afternoon, while they repaired a broken windmill, Carl paused and looked out toward the horizon. "When war finish," he said, "I go home, but home maybe not same, maybe gone." Thomas nodded. "Nothing stays the same after war, but you'll rebuild." Carl turned to him. "You too." The words startled Thomas. He realized then that rebuilding didn't just belong to nations, it belonged to hearts. When the official notice came weeks later that Germany had surrendered, the prisoners didn't cheer. They stood silently as the sergeant read the announcement, hats in hand. The war that had shaped and broken their lives was finally over. That night, Thomas built a fire behind the barn. The sky was clear, the air cool and still. He sat with the guards and the prisoners alike, the boundaries between them fading in the glow of the flames. Someone passed around a harmonica, and one of the Germans began to play. The melody was soft, haunting, familiar even to those who didn't know its name. It was Lily Marlene, the song that had drifted across battlefields to both sides, a tune that had outlived the war itself. Thomas listened, his hands folded in his lap. The firelight flickered over the faces of men who, only months ago, would have shot at each other without hesitation. Now they shared the same warmth, the same tired relief. When the song ended, no one clapped. They just sat in silence, the night filled with crickets and memory. Eventually, Harper stood. "You boys will be heading home soon," he said, "back across the ocean." Carl looked down at the dirt, then back at Thomas. "Thank you," he said softly, "for meal, for everything." Thomas nodded. "You take care of yourself." The young man smiled faintly. "I will. Maybe someday you visit Germany. I show you my farm." Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. "I'll stick to Texas, but I'll think of that river you told me about." When the trucks came at dawn, Thomas watched them go from the gate. The prisoners waved from the back, faces half lit by the rising sun. Carl lifted his hand one last time before the truck disappeared into the distance. The ranch was quiet again. Too quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet now, not the silence of loss, but the peace that follows understanding. In the years that came after the war, stories like Thomas's spread quietly across Texas. Local papers wrote about how German prisoners had worked the fields, fixed fences, harvested crops. Many Texans admitted they'd come to respect the young men they once feared. Some of the prisoners even returned years later, no longer enemies but visitors, seeking out the ranchers who had treated them as men, not monsters. Historians would call it one of the most unexpected chapters of the war, a campaign of decency fought not with weapons but with food, fairness, and work. Thomas never thought of himself as part of any grand story. He just knew that the meal he cooked that night, the one made from grief and memory, had done something no sermon or flag could have achieved. It had turned hatred into recognition, sorrow into connection. He kept his son's dog tags hanging on the same nail by the kitchen door. Every Sunday, he made the same meal: chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes, cornbread, and pecan pie. He ate alone, but not in loneliness. Sometimes, as the wind moved across the fields, he imagined he could still hear laughter, the echo of young men speaking half English, half German, their voices carried away into the Texas dusk. He would sit back, sip his coffee, and whisper into the empty room, "For you, son, and for all of them, too." In the end, what happened on that small ranch outside of Abilene became something larger than war. It was proof that compassion could survive even the ugliest years of history. The meal Thomas Avery cooked for his dead son's enemies became a quiet legend, passed down through families, retold by historians, and remembered by those who had sat at that table. They would say that for one night in 1944, a grieving father turned his pain into kindness and, in doing so, reminded the world of something simple yet profound, that peace isn't signed in ink or declared by generals. It's built one act of grace at a time, by ordinary people who choose humanity over hate. And under the wide Texas sky, where the wind never stops and the earth remembers everything, that truth still lingers, soft as the smell of fried steak in a kitchen where love once lived, and where, for a single evening, the world had finally learned to forgive.